Hello everyone, and welcome back to another collection of horrible fates. In this video, we're doing 4 more incredibly strange cases that demonstrate that terrible things happen to good people for no reason at all. Whether they're completely random, poorly planned, or slightly self-inflicted, they're horrible all the same. So as always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. On the afternoon of January 21st, 1988, a tow truck driver named Dell was sent to a vacant property on Glenwood Avenue in Akron, Ohio. Police wanted an abandoned car removed from the lawn beside a house. It was the type of job Dell had completed hundreds, maybe thousands of times before. When he arrived, the place looked deserted and the house was indeed empty, having been abandoned for some time. Dell then got to work preparing to remove the vehicle outside, but as he did, he heard something that stopped him dead in his tracks. A woman was screaming from inside the garage. The building was closed up and the property was supposed to be unoccupied, but the cries kept coming regardless. Dell then went to investigate and looked through a window. Inside one of the cars in the garage, he saw an arm moving. After making sure his eyes weren't just playing tricks on him, he rushed back to his truck to notify authorities. Firefighters were then called in to force open the garage door, and when they finally got inside, they found a disturbing scene. A 20-year-old woman named Daisy Gladden was trapped inside a car beneath the body of her boyfriend, 26-year-old James Daniels Jr. Most horrifying of all, James was dead, and judging by the condition of his naked body, he had not died recently. Daisy, meanwhile, was somehow still alive, but she was in terrible shape. Paramedics said she was suffering from hypothermia, and she had on little more than a cloth raincoat. Somehow, she had survived for days, pinned in that car under the weight of a decomposing corpse. And little about this seemed to make sense at first. Daisy and James had been found in the same car, in the same garage, after apparently being there for several days. Yet when the garage was opened, one of them was dead and already decomposing, while the other was somehow still breathing. James's body was wedged over Daisy in the front seat, making it difficult for her to move. He was about 5'10" and weighed somewhere around 170 pounds, and police said Daisy was much smaller. In that cramped space, with his full dead weight pressing down on her, getting free may have been next to impossible even if she had been fully conscious and physically able to fight her way out, but Daisy was in no condition to do that. In addition to suffering the effects of hypothermia, officers came away believing that by the time she realized James was dead, her body may have been going numb. Loss of circulation, combined with exhaustion, cold, and whatever else she had been exposed to inside the car may have left her too weak to lift him or even think clearly enough to save herself. Investigators then began piecing together what they believed happened inside the garage. According to Daisy, she and James had gone there on their own to drink, smoke, and as she later put it, have a little party. Police suspected the pair had chosen the vacant property for privacy and had parked inside the garage so they could be alone. And Daisy told them the two had been drinking and smoking before passing time in the front seat. She also said they had been doing other things, insinuating that romance was also involved. Tragically though, the ignition to the car was found switched on and the gas tank was empty by the time the car was discovered. Investigators came to believe that the engine had been running while Daisy and James sat together in the front seat and that at some stage both of them lost consciousness. Daisy also wasn't certain whether they had gone there on a Sunday or a Monday, but she was found on a Thursday. Based on the condition of James's body, one investigator believed he had probably died on Monday. That meant Daisy had been trapped beneath him for days before Dell heard her cries for help. Another strange part of the case, though, were the medical results. In subsequent testing, authorities determined that James had a carbon monoxide saturation level of 71.1% in his blood. Daisy's level was said to be about 65%. That gap might not sound huge, but it was critical. Levels above 70% are generally considered fatal, which meant James had crossed into the range where survival was unlikely. Daisy somehow, though, had not. She was still in serious danger, but she had remained just below that threshold. This didn't make sense because investigators knew the couple had been in the same car under the same conditions for that same stretch of time. James's autopsy didn't provide a neat answer either. It was ruled inconclusive and no alcohol or drugs were found in his system. That left officials trying to account for why he died and Daisy lived. One possibility raised by the coroner was that Daisy's metabolic rate may have been lower than that of James. Her body may have processed the poisonous gas more slowly, buying her just enough time to survive what should have killed them both. Daisy ended up briefly in a local hospital to be treated for hypothermia and was listed in fair condition, according to news reports at the time. Otherwise, all signs seem to indicate that she made a full recovery, at least physically. It's probably safe to assume the ordeal was quite traumatic. Most people probably have at least a vague idea of what a chastity belt is. But for those who don't, a chastity belt was supposed to be a locked garment designed to block intercourse or masturbation. Most depictions show something like rigid metal underwear fastened around the waist, with small openings left for basic bodily functions. And you might be thinking this sounds cruel and impractical, and you're right, and in real life it would have posed problems almost immediately. A person forced to wear something like that for any extended period would have been dealing with pain, chafing, and a constant risk of infection. Despite the obvious impracticality though, the stories of chastity belt usage persist, and they usually go something a little like this. As medieval knights prepared to leave home for months or even years during the Crusades, they decided that the safest way to guarantee their wives' faithfulness was to lock the metal device around their bodies until the knights returned. But while these types of stories have been accepted as fact over generations, historians have found little reason to believe it actually happened that way. In fact, there is no credible evidence showing that chastity belts were a standard feature of medieval life. Historians who have dug into the subject have generally concluded that these devices were not part of routine life in the Middle Ages, and that the classic image of women being locked into them for long stretches is more folklore than fact. The chastity belt was actually largely retrofitted into history by later generations who were fascinated by the idea of a dark barbaric past. A lot of this myth-making picked up speed in the 19th century when Europe developed a strong appetite for all things Gothic. Museums, curiosity shows, and private collectors were eager for shocking objects that could be presented as relics of earlier cruelty, and chastity belts fit that bill. Some examples were even manufactured or embellished simply because people were willing to pay to see them. They were sensational and easy to display, and the result was that the chastity belt became even more famous in the modern imagination than it likely ever was in real-life history. That doesn't mean every version was purely fictional, though. Devices meant to control sexuality did exist in later centuries, especially as anti-masturbation gadgets sold under the banner of health and morality. But the chastity belts that most people picture is probably not a standard object from medieval or even Middle Ages Europe. Whatever form these devices took, however, the idea was physically dangerous from the start. Even the more elaborate versions from later centuries would have created serious problems for anyone forced to wear one continuously. Some accounts claim that Renaissance-era models were lined or padded to keep the metal from constantly rubbing against the skin, but even that wouldn't have been enough to make them safe. A garment like this would have needed regular removal, cleaning, and adjustment just to avoid injuring the wearer. The human body just doesn't tolerate confinement like that very well. Prolonged friction can break the skin, and moisture and trapped waste can turn irritation into open sores. And as if anyone needed any proof of this being the result of wearing one, you need to look no further back than 1987. In late June of that year, in a village deep in the Peruvian jungle, Dionisio Vela and his wife, 22-year-old Rosa Esquin, lived far from the world of museum displays and old European legends. But the idea behind the chastity belt was the same. Dionisio was intensely jealous, and when he left home on business trips, he wanted a way to control what happened in his absence, so he created a chastity belt for Rosa. The garment he ended up making was a rough homemade belt fashioned from rawhide that was crude and immensely tight. To keep it secured, he made sure to fasten it with a padlock. Each time he went away, he made Rosa put it on before he locked it up and took the key with him wherever he was going. Unfortunately, Rosa quickly found out that wearing this was a constant issue. The rawhide itself would have been abrasive enough, but the lock made things all the worse. At some point during one of Dionisio's trips, he was away longer than expected, and while he was gone, the rusty padlock pressed and eventually cut into Rosa's skin. It likely started as just irritation, but it soon turned into a wound, and that turned into something far more dangerous. In a place where help was not easily available, and with the key gone along with her husband, Rosa was left trapped inside the chastity belt. So by the time Dionisio returned, the damage had already reached a point of no return. The injury had become infected, and the infection spread through her body. 3 days after he got back to Peru from his trip, Rosa died of septicemic poisoning, a fatal blood infection brought on by the device her husband had chosen to lock her into before leaving home. After centuries of myths surrounding chastity belts, the basic danger behind the idea had finally played out in the most literal and horrifying way possible. Rosa's death became a criminal case as authorities concluded that the infection caused by the belt had killed her. A state prosecutor said Dionisio would face at least 5 years in prison for what he had done, but no further reporting exists to confirm how much time, if any, he was later sentenced to. By all accounts, Laverne Landis seemed to be the sort of person other people trusted. She was from St. Paul, Minnesota, a 48-year-old widowed mother of 5 adult children, and working as a registered nurse at St. Joseph's Hospital. Friends and relatives found her to be steady, thoughtful, and deeply interested in other people. They described her as someone who tried to lift others up and the kind of person who would tell you to look on the bright side when life started to get difficult. Despite her coming off as someone with deep roots in reality, though, Laverne also had a bit of a curious mind. She was fascinated by questions that don't have neat answers, and especially anything involving the mind, consciousness, and psychic experiences. At one point, she reflected on how much modern medicine had uncovered about the body compared to how little people seemed to understand about the mind. And that curiosity had apparently been with her for some time, but those close to her believed it grew much stronger after her husband died in 1975. It was then that this interest gradually grew into something that consumed her. A few years later, in 1978, this growing obsession led her to a group called Search and Prove. The organization promoted ideas about psychic development and astral projection, and for Laverne, it seems to have provided her with a lifestyle framework and a community for beliefs she already espoused. Search and Prove taught that spirits could be reached through meditation and out-of-body experiences. Members believed a person's spirit could leave the physical body and operate on its own, moving through different levels of existence. The group's leader, Jerry Gross, was said to channel a spirit called Mora, who supposedly spoke through him in a rough voice and offered guidance on how members should live and how the astral world was arranged. To outsiders, all of this sounded bizarre, and understandably so, but to the people inside the Search and Prove circle, it seemed to have offered certainty and purpose. Inside this environment, Laverne met 38-year-old Gerald Flatch. He was actually a co-founder of the organization. Unlike Laverne, Gerald already had an interest in UFOs before becoming involved with the group, although people who knew him didn't see that interest as extreme at first. Once he and Laverne became connected through the group, however, their beliefs appeared to have started to feed off each other. What one of them was willing to consider, the other was willing to follow a step farther, and that dynamic would lead to something far worse. Early in 1982, whatever Laverne and Gerald believed they were chasing began pulling them further and further away from their ordinary lives. That year, the two attended a psychic convention together in California, and afterward, their lives seemed to change. They started leaving for days at a time without telling family members where they were headed, and over the following months, they traveled through Minnesota, Wisconsin, and North Dakota in search of spiritual contact and signs from aliens. What exactly they expected to find was not always clear to the people around them, but it was obvious that both had become increasingly absorbed in that search. By May 17th, they had effectively vanished from their normal routines. Gerald's wife eventually traced him to a motel through charges on the couple's credit card bill, but even then he refused to return home. After 14 years of marriage, she later filed for divorce, and it was granted on October 25th while he was still missing. Laverne's family was alarmed as well. At one point, one of her daughters reached out to Jerry and warned that she would report her mother missing if she didn't hear from her soon. Laverne did call home not long afterward, but the contact was brief and did little to explain where she had been or what she was doing. By the fall of 1982, Laverne and Gerald's spiritual journey carried them deep into northern Minnesota. Gerald later said that messages were coming to him through Laverne from a higher power, and that those messages had directed them north for what they believed would be a pickup by a UFO. At some point during their travels, they made contact out in the Dakotas and were guided toward the Gunflint Trail through a remote expanse of forest and lakes. Around October 5th, Laverne and Gerald reached the Loon Lake boat landing and settled into a secluded clearing near the water. The spot was isolated and surrounded by wooded hills and tall trees. There they remained in their car through early October and into November, waiting for whatever they believed had been promised to them by the spirits. Laverne was apparently receiving near-nightly reassurance from them that the pickup would happen, and the messages kept telling her to hold on a little longer and stay put, so that's what they did. While the weather worsened around them and the wilderness grew colder and less forgiving, the promise of rescue by a flying saucer never seemed to lose its grip on the pair. Days turned into weeks without the pair ever leaving their car, and food quickly dwindled. Once it was gone, they survived for 3 weeks by eating only vitamins. Apparently, the spirits told Laverne that they did not need to eat, so instead of treating their growing hunger as a warning, they simply endured it. Eventually, the surface of the lake froze, cutting off their water supply. Still, neither of them seemed to be concerned because the otherworldly messages kept coming in. By this point, they had no heat and no food or water. Even their clothing wasn't sufficient for the elements they were faced with, yet they didn't leave. Then, on November 15th, after weeks of waiting in worsening conditions, Gerald reached a point where he could no longer get any response from Laverne. So weak, dehydrated, and suffering from the cold himself, he left the car and struggled through the snow to the road. The distance was only about a quarter mile, but in his condition, it might as well have been much longer. He stumbled and crawled until he was finally seen by a passing motorist, which saved his life. Laverne, however, wasn't so lucky. She had succumbed to a combination of hypothermia, starvation, and dehydration while waiting for their UFO pickup. By then, the ground was covered in snow and the temperature had dropped to around -10 Fahrenheit or -23°C. Laverne had been trying to endure those conditions in only sandals, slacks, a sweater, and a coat. Gerald would survive, but barely. Later, after being released from the hospital, relatives took him to Fargo, North Dakota for psychiatric treatment. On the afternoon of Monday, January 23rd, 1989, an 11-year-old girl was in the middle of completing her newspaper delivery route in Rochester, New York. As she traveled down Congress Avenue, tossing the day's Times-Union newspaper on 2 doorsteps, she approached house number 202 and spotted something strange almost immediately. Now, it wasn't terribly uncommon for her to witness odd behavior from the man who lived there. Robert Ham, who was 73 years old, was known in the neighborhood to be a little unusual, but people preferred to describe him in a slightly more polite way as eccentric. He lived there alone and enjoyed sitting on a chair in his enclosed porch, but outside of that, it's unclear what exactly gave his neighbors that impression of him. But in any case, what the newspaper girl saw that afternoon, though, was different from her usual interactions with him. Through the glass-enclosed porch, she swore she saw Robert waving at her and heard him say something she couldn't quite understand, but he was doing it from inside of a garbage can. Unsure of what she was really seeing, though, the girl gave him a tentative wave in return before throwing a newspaper onto his front step and continuing on with her route. Later that evening, the newspaper girl told her mother about what she saw at Robert's house earlier that afternoon. Her mother, though, wrote it off as the wild imagination of a little girl, believing the reflections of the glass were just playing tricks on her eyes, and the two didn't speak any more of it that day. The next day, a mail carrier was delivering on his Congress Avenue route when he encountered Robert in the exact same position as the newspaper girl. Thinking it was odd, the mailman stared for a moment, trying to make sense of what he was actually seeing until he saw Robert's hand moving as if waving at him. The mailman waved right back, believing that Robert was just being his strange self again, and walked on to the next house to continue delivering the mail. At some point that afternoon, the newspaper girl was out collecting money for her deliveries with her brother, and they both saw the exact same thing at 202 Congress Avenue that the girl saw the day before. Once again, she told her mother after finishing a route, and once again, it was outright dismissed as anything to be concerned about. As the night wore on, though, the newspaper girl's mother thought about the sightings a bit more. Why would her daughter believe she saw Robert in a garbage can 2 days in a row? It just didn't make any sense, so on Wednesday morning, the mother decided to go back and check things out for herself. As it was approaching 11 a.m., she walked down the street to Robert's house and peered through the glass on the porch. And just as her daughter told her, there was Robert stuffed inside a metal garbage can up to his armpits with his legs protruding, only this time he wasn't waving. In fact, he wasn't moving at all. At some point between Tuesday evening and Wednesday morning, Robert passed away inside that trash can. The police were then notified and quickly arrived at the strange scene. After gathering the facts and talking to witnesses, investigators came to believe that Robert had somehow fallen backward into the standard-sized metal garbage can on the porch and then found himself unable to get back out. The can was the usual kind people kept around at the time. It wasn't especially large, but it was big enough for a man of Robert's medium height and build to become trapped in an awkward position. And once he was down inside it, he didn't have the leverage or strength to free himself. Police also came to believe that alcohol may have played a role in how it happened. Their theory was that Robert had come out onto the porch while drinking and then either stumbled or lost his balance and went over backward into the can. An open stepladder was also found near the front door, leading police to believe that he might have brought the garbage can onto the porch to help with some sort of repair work. As for the waving Robert did from inside the can to the newspaper girl and the mailman, he might have been trying to signal that he needed help but was not able to do it in a way that conveyed the trouble he was in. Particularly by Tuesday, he may have already been badly weakened by his ordeal, and a simple wave was all he could muster to communicate that he needed help. Tragically, those waves were translated as greetings. Police said they didn't believe that foul play was involved in Robert's death, as nothing at the scene suggested that anyone had attacked him or deliberately left him trapped there. An autopsy later determined that Robert had died of acute coronary insufficiency brought on by heart disease. This was a condition that was exacerbated by being stuck in a garbage can for at least 3 days.
If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, and a special thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon or as a channel member.
If you're interested, we offer early access videos that are released roughly a week before the regular YouTube uploads. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it using the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.